The man who never gave up. I never thought working the night shift at a convenience store would be anything special. Most of the time, it's just me, the quiet store, and the occasional customer buying snacks or drinks. But there was one man who changed everything. I first noticed him about 2 weeks after I started working there. He was a regular customer, always coming in around 2 a.m. He had this strange habit of trying to make small talk with me. At first, I didn't think much of it. He'd ask about my day or talk about the weather, but something about his tone always felt off. It was as if he was trying too hard to connect with me, like he knew something I didn't. Over time, his visits became more frequent. Every night, without fail, he'd come in at almost the exact same time, buy a pack of cigarettes, and ask me questions. "How's your night going? Busy? You live around here?" I started to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't that he was rude or aggressive, just persistent. There was always something unsettling in his eyes, a quiet intensity that seemed to follow me wherever I went in the store. He never stayed too long, but his presence lingered long after he left. It wasn't just the conversations that started to get to me. There was something else about him, something I couldn't place. Sometimes after he left, I would notice that the layout of the store had changed. Small things, like a pack of gum being moved from one shelf to another, or the magazines I had stacked neatly on the counter being slightly disturbed. At first, I thought maybe I was just imagining it, but then I started to notice more. Once, I found the store's bathroom door wide open after he'd left. Even though I'd locked it after the last customer, that was when I started wondering if he was coming in when I wasn't looking, sneaking around, watching me. I didn't want to believe it at first. I told myself that I was overthinking everything. But then, one night I saw him again. This time he didn't buy anything. He just stood by the counter staring at me, not in a casual way, but like he was studying me. I asked if he needed help, and he just nodded, a faint smile on his lips. He didn't say anything, though. He just stood there still, like he was waiting for me to say something. When I didn't, he finally left, but his eyes stayed with me long after he was gone. It felt like he had seen something in me, something that made him want to stick around just a little longer. The pattern continued for a few more nights. He'd come in at the same time, ask the same questions, and leave with that same unsettling smile. It wasn't just his visits that began to make me feel uneasy. It was his quiet observation of everything around him. He never bought anything other than the cigarettes, never asked for anything else. But there was a presence about him that started to make me feel like I was the one being watched, like I was the subject of some strange experiment. It got worse when I noticed that sometimes the store's lights would flicker after he left, like they were somehow responding to his presence. One night, I decided I had had enough. As he stood there once again, just staring at me without saying a word, I asked him what he wanted. "What's your deal?" I said, trying to sound confident. "Why do you keep coming in here like this?" He didn't flinch, didn't even seem surprised by the question. He just looked at me with those unnerving eyes and said, "I'm just trying to find out where you go after this. I'm trying to figure out how to make you stay." I froze. My blood ran cold. I thought I had misheard him. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, my voice shaking. He just smiled again, that same empty smile, and said, "You'll understand soon enough." That was the last straw for me. I didn't know what he meant by that or why he'd said it, but it was enough to make me call my manager and tell her I was done working the night shift. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, that I was in danger. The thought of him showing up again made my skin crawl. But of course, I had to finish my shift that night. I tried to stay busy, focusing on stocking the shelves, wiping down the counter, anything to keep my mind off what he had said. I thought maybe I was just being dramatic. Maybe he was just an odd customer who didn't know boundaries. But as the night went on, that feeling of being watched never left. And then, around 3 a.m., he showed up again. I didn't see him walk in at first, just heard the faint sound of the door chime. I turned around and there he was, standing in the same spot he always did. But this time, his eyes were different. They were darker, almost hollow, and he was looking at me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. I walked over to him, forcing myself to ask, "What do you want?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stared at me, and then, with a voice that was almost a whisper, he said, "I told you, I'm just trying to make you stay." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I wanted to run, to escape, but something in the back of my mind told me that wouldn't be enough. I took a step back, but before I could move further, he spoke again. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice was calm, too calm. "You can't leave. I won't let you." At that moment, I realized I wasn't dealing with a normal customer anymore. His smile, once so harmless, now seemed sinister. My heart raced and I could feel panic rising in my chest. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay here with him any longer. I turned to walk to the back of the store, hoping to find an exit or at least a way to escape, but he followed me, quietly, without a word. It was as though he had planned every step of this. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to dial the police, but my fingers slipped. Over the screen, unable to focus. As I glanced up, I saw him standing at the end of the hallway, his eyes never leaving me. The expression on his face was unreadable, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me, making it impossible to move or think clearly. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew one thing. This man was not going to stop. I finally managed to dial the police, but as I waited for the call to connect, I noticed something strange. The lights in the store started flickering. Again, just like the last time he had been there. It felt like the air was getting heavier, more oppressive, like something was closing in around me. When I looked back at him, he was even closer, standing just a few feet away now, smiling that same disturbing smile. "You don't have to call anyone," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "You're not going anywhere, not tonight." My heart pounded in my chest, and I backed away, my hands still gripping my phone. Before I could react, the door opened. A customer walked in, and the man immediately turned and walked past him without a word. It was as if he had never been there at all. The lights went back to normal, and the oppressive feeling lifted just as quickly as it had come. The customer glanced at me, confused by my pale face and trembling hands. I couldn't even explain what had just happened. I ended the call with the police, feeling like I had just narrowly escaped something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. That night, I left the store early and never went back. To this day, I haven't seen him again, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to make me stay. The new roommate. When Vanessa, one of my roommates, decided to move out, we started looking for someone new to take her place. At first, we weren't too picky. We just needed someone who would pay their share of the rent and wouldn't cause problems. After a few interviews, we found Felipe. He seemed like a quiet guy, not the party type, and we all agreed that he'd be a good fit. He moved in with just a few bags and his laptop, and for the first couple of weeks everything was normal. He'd stay in his room, didn't have loud friends over, and seemed to keep to himself. But soon, little things started happening that made me uncomfortable. At first, it was small stuff, nothing major. I'd noticed my shampoo bottle was out of place, or my clothes would be slightly moved in the laundry room. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid, or that I had misplaced things myself. But then it started happening more often. My computer would be turned on when I was sure I'd left it off. Once, I came home to find my bedspread had been moved, like someone had sat on my bed, or worse, laid on it. I brushed it off as nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just about the little things anymore. As time went on, I started feeling more and more uneasy. I'd hear sounds in the house. When I was alone. Footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, or the sound of my door creaking open. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but there were moments when I couldn't ignore it. I'd come back from work to find the door to my room slightly ajar, even though I always kept it closed when I left. It wasn't just a random thing anymore. Felipe's behavior was becoming harder to explain. One night I came home earlier than usual and caught Felipe standing in the middle of the living room, just staring at my bedroom door. He didn't hear me come in at first, and when I called his name, he jumped and quickly turned around. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me for a second before offering a half-hearted smile. "Oh, hey," he said, like nothing was wrong. But there was something in his eyes that made me feel uncomfortable, like he had been doing something he shouldn't. I didn't press it, though. I just gave him a quick nod and went to my room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The next few days were worse. I started noticing more and more things out of place, items missing from my desk, papers shuffled around, and even my personal belongings being moved to different spots in the house. I tried to confront Felipe about it, but he just brushed it off, claiming that he must have accidentally touched my things while looking for something of his own. He apologized, but it didn't feel genuine. There was no way he could have been that careless every single time. And the worst part? The feeling that someone was watching me grew stronger. One afternoon, I decided to get to the bottom of it. I was sure Felipe was either snooping around or doing something far worse. So I made a plan to catch him in the act. I set my phone to record in my room, then pretended to leave the apartment like I usually did. I waited for a while before coming back, trying to time it perfectly. When I entered, I crept up to my room, careful not to make a sound. There, I saw him. Felipe was sitting at my desk, staring at my computer screen. He didn't notice me until I stood in the doorway. The look on his face when he saw me was terrifying. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights, frozen in place. Felipe didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring at me, as if he hadn't expected me to come back so soon. My heart was pounding, and for a split second I couldn't speak. I was too shocked to process what I was seeing. It wasn't just that he had been in my room. It was the fact that he had been going through my things without my permission. I thought I was going to explode with anger, but I couldn't bring myself to yell at him. Instead, I just asked him what he was doing. His response was a quiet, almost eerie, "I was just looking at something." I tried to keep calm, but inside I was furious. "Looking at what?" I asked, crossing my arms. He hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't being honest. He gave me some excuse about checking out something I had left open on my screen, but I wasn't buying it. It was clear that this wasn't a simple mistake. Something about the way he acted, his nervous energy, the way he avoided eye contact, made me realize that this was more than just a case of a roommate being careless. This was deliberate. The tension in the room was unbearable. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to scream at him, ask him why he felt entitled to go through my personal things, but I held back. Instead, I decided to leave and give myself some space to think. I went into the kitchen to grab some water, but Felipe followed me. He apologized again, but this time it felt insincere. His words were empty, almost like he was trying to cover up something he wasn't willing to admit. I didn't trust him anymore. The trust had been broken, and now I had to figure out what he was hiding. The next day, I decided to go through my things. Everything. Needed to make sure nothing else was missing or tampered with. When I opened my closet, I found that one of my jackets was out of place. I didn't remember wearing it recently, but it was sitting on top of my shelf, folded neatly. It was strange. I had been meticulous about where I put my clothes, and I was certain I hadn't left it out. Then I checked my drawer. My phone charger was gone. That's when I realized just how far Felipe had gone. He wasn't just going through my things. He was taking things. I started feeling paranoid. What else had he taken? What else had he been going through while I wasn't there? I couldn't stop thinking about it, and it was starting to drive me crazy. The idea that Felipe had been in my room, going through my things, was bad enough, but the thought that he might have been taking things all along was worse. I started looking through every drawer, every cabinet, every box, hoping I'd find something that would explain why he was doing this. But when I checked my computer, I was faced with something even worse. There was a new file on my desktop, one I didn't put there. I opened it, heart racing, hoping it was nothing. But when I clicked on it, I found that it was a video. The file was a recording of me in my room. The camera was shaky at first, but it quickly steadied, showing me sitting at my desk, just like I had earlier. I could see myself through the small screen of my laptop. The recording was from a few days ago, but it was clear that Felipe had set up the camera to record me while I was working. My hands were trembling as I watched, realizing that he had been spying on me. I felt sick to my stomach. My first thought was to confront him right then and there, but then another thought hit me. What if he had more? I decided to check my other devices, the ones I didn't usually leave around. My tablet, my phone, and even my camera. I found nothing at first, but then, in the back of my mind, I recalled something strange. Felipe had borrowed my camera a few days ago to take pictures of some of his stuff for an online project he claimed he was working on. I hadn't thought much of it then, but now it felt like a warning sign. I rushed over to my camera, turning it on, hoping I wasn't about to find another video. Sure enough, as soon as I checked the recent files, there it was. Another recording. This time, it was of me sleeping. The camera was focused on my face, capturing the slow, steady rise and fall of my chest. My body tensed as I realized Felipe had been in my room while I was sleeping, probably for hours. I wanted to throw up. The more I looked at the footage, the clearer it became that this had been going on for a while. Felipe had been watching me, recording me without my knowledge. I knew at that moment that I had to leave. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore, not knowing what he was capable of. I packed my things in a panic, not bothering to organize anything. I just wanted out. As I was gathering my stuff, I heard a knock at the door. Felipe. I froze, unable to move. My heart raced as I heard his voice through the door calling my name softly. "Are you all right? I know you're upset. We should talk." There was something in his tone that made my blood run cold, like he knew exactly what I had found, like he was just waiting for me to come to terms with it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The fear of facing him, of seeing his face after everything, paralyzed me. I left through the back door, quickly disappearing into the night. I didn't know where I was going at first, but I couldn't stay there any longer. Felipe's presence, his quiet watchfulness, was unbearable. I stayed with a friend for a few days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, that he knew exactly where I was. I never reported him to the police. I don't even know if I could have proved anything beyond the videos. But I know one thing for sure. He was watching, and I was just another one of his subjects. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that Felipe is still out there, still recording, still following his next victim. I left that apartment behind, but I'm not sure if I ever really escaped. The friend who knew too much. When my parents decided to move to a smaller neighborhood, I thought it would be a nightmare. I was 17 years old and liked my routine in the big city, so I wasn't excited about the idea of starting over in a place where everyone knew each other. But, surprisingly, I made a friend quickly. Ricardo lived 2 houses down from mine and was my age. He showed up at my door on the second day after the move and invited me to play video games at his house. He was a laid-back guy, seemed a bit introverted, but we got along right away. But over time, some things started to bother me. At first, it was just strange comments, like him mentioning something I had done at home, even though I hadn't told anyone about it. I thought maybe my mom had said something to his mom, or it was just a coincidence, but it wasn't. One time I mentioned that I didn't like to sleep with the door to my room open because it made me feel uneasy. Nothing too strange there. But days later he asked out of nowhere, "But why do you lock your door if you never locked it before?" I laughed, a little embarrassed, and asked how he knew that. He just shrugged and changed the subject. That stayed in my mind. I didn't know what to think. Things got worse when he started, mentioning very specific details about my house. Like one day, he said the floor in the hallway creaked more near my room, and that it must be annoying at night. I'd never told anyone that. The only way he could know would be if he'd been in my hallway before. After that, I started paying closer attention. Small things started piling up, like him commenting on the scent of the fabric softener my mom used, or about a painting that hung in the hallway outside my room. One day, he mentioned that the light in the bathroom of my room flickered sometimes, something I'd never told anyone. That's when my paranoia really started. I began checking doors and windows before bed, paying attention whenever I heard any strange sounds in the house. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that maybe he had noticed these things on some visit, I don't know. But then, one day, I came home from school early because a teacher had cancelled class, and I found the back door unlocked. My heart raced. Instantly. My parents wouldn't be back until late in the afternoon, and I was absolutely certain I had locked everything before leaving. I walked in slowly, trying not to make any noise. The house seemed normal, but there was something wrong. The silence felt different, like I wasn't alone. When I got to the hallway, I stopped breathing. Ricardo was there, standing with his back to me, staring fixedly at the door to my room. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stared. For a second, I froze, not knowing what to do. Then, as if he had sensed my presence, he turned his head slowly towards me. The way he looked at me, man, I'll never forget it. It wasn't the look of someone caught red-handed. It was a vacant, calculated look, like he was analyzing me. In that moment, I didn't know if I should run, scream, or pretend it was nothing. My body wanted to react, but my mind was still trying to come up with a rational explanation. Ricardo gave a small smile, but didn't say anything. He just walked slowly towards me, as if nothing was wrong. When he passed me, he gave a light pat on my shoulder and said, "See you later," before leaving through the front door like any regular visitor. I stood there, frozen, my skin crawling, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading outside. When I finally managed to move, I ran to the door, locked everything, and went straight to my room. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I started to check every corner of the house, trying to understand how the hell he got in. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing out of place, no windows open. But when I went to the back, I saw faint footprints on the dirt near the fence that divided my yard from the neighbors. The fence was low. He could easily have jumped over. What unsettled me most was realizing that those footprints didn't just come from the direction of his house. They went back and forth multiple times, as if he'd done this before, as if entering my house was something normal for him. After that encounter, I was overwhelmed by the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I spent the rest of the day unable to concentrate, hardly able to eat or relax, and every minute seemed to drag on in unbearable anxiety. The image of that cold, calculating look from Ricardo wouldn't leave me. It appeared whenever I closed my eyes. During classes, my mind wandered, wondering if that same guy, who seemed normal at other times, was capable of something so sinister. Every sound and every shadow at home made me think he was there, hiding in some corner, watching me. I tried to rationalize, but the feeling of danger was palpable. I wondered if all of this was just the product of my overactive imagination, but his presence was undeniable. The experience marked me in a profound and inexplicable way. When the day finally ended, the unease turned into a fear that wouldn't leave me. I spent hours looking out the window, trying to find a logical explanation for what had happened, but nothing fit. I kept wondering if Ricardo was just a troubled kid, or if there was something much darker behind his strange behavior. In the silence of the night, every sound seemed like a possible omen of new danger, and I couldn't stop imagining that this silent invasion could happen again at any moment. I hardly slept, with my heart racing at every noise, and the feeling of vulnerability settled in powerfully. To this day, when I remember that day, I feel a chill down my spine, as if the mystery was never solved. It was an experience that left a scar, an inexplicable fear that continues to haunt me. The next day, I woke up with the feeling that the previous day hadn't been just a figment of my imagination. Even though I tried to convince myself it was all nonsense, the feeling that something was out of place lingered. During breakfast, the details I couldn't stop thinking about consumed me. Ricardo's empty stare, the silent footsteps, even the sound of the wind outside seemed to announce something sinister. I became obsessed with checking every detail of the house, replaying every movement and every sound that might have gone unnoticed. At work, I could barely concentrate, and each second seemed to stretch on with an inexplicable weight. I felt a sense of urgency to understand whether he had really broken into my house or if my mind was playing tricks on me. This constant doubt followed me throughout the day, making me question whether I was seeing things that didn't exist. The routine that had once felt normal now carried an invisible, silent fear that wouldn't let me go for a moment. When I returned home, every corner seemed charged with a hidden presence, as if the objects were being watched. When I opened the door, I noticed that the atmosphere was different, filled with a strange energy that made me shiver. I went straight to my room, trying to convince myself it was just a bad day, but every sound, every shadow reminded me of Ricardo's fixed stare. I sat on the bed and started going over my memories, trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't seem to make sense. It was as if time itself had conspired to leave me without answers, but with a growing fear that was settling into every corner of my house. I knew something had changed, and that this experience wouldn't be easily forgotten. I stayed there, trying to find a sign of normalcy, while doubt and fear turned into an almost tangible presence. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, even though I was alone. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the silence in my room almost suffocating. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see that moment, Ricardo's cold stare, his unmoving presence. It felt as if my own thoughts were becoming distorted, tangled with anxiety and fear. I thought about calling the police, but something held me back. Was I just overreacting? What would I even tell them? A kid was in my house, without permission. It sounded ridiculous, even to me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much my perception of reality was slipping. I kept telling myself that I was probably just paranoid, but the fear was too real. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, I saw Ricardo again. This time he was standing by his fence, staring at my house. No smile, no wave, just standing there, unmoving. I tried to brush it off as nothing, but my heart skipped a beat. It was like he was waiting for something, watching me, watching my every move. I quickly went inside, trying not to make eye contact. The whole day, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was still watching, even though I never saw him again that afternoon. It became clear to me that whatever was going on with him, whatever had happened the previous day, was far from over, and I had no idea what to do about it. The feeling that I was trapped in some strange game where the rules didn't make sense lingered in my mind, making me feel increasingly powerless. The next few days passed by with an eerie tension that I couldn't shake. I didn't see Ricardo again after that day by the fence, but it didn't matter. The feeling that something was terribly off didn't leave me. It lingered in my thoughts, in the way I checked every door and window before leaving the house, and how I would stare out the windows, hoping not to catch sight of him. Every part of me wanted to confront him, demand answers, but deep down, I knew something was far more wrong than I could understand. I had no proof, nothing solid enough to make sense of. It felt like I was the only one who could feel it, and that made the fear all the more isolating. Then, as abruptly as it had started, it all stopped. One day I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about Ricardo in hours, maybe even days. He was gone, disappeared from my life just as quickly as he had entered it. The house felt quieter, lighter, but I couldn't shake the lingering feeling that whatever had happened, whatever had been building up, wasn't something I would ever fully understand. It's been months now, and every time I think back to those days, I still get the chills. No one else noticed anything. No one else seemed to feel it. And I never did find out what Ricardo's intentions were, or if he was even real. All I know is that it ended as suddenly as it began, leaving me with nothing but a lingering sense of dread that I carry with me, even today. The app ride. It was one of those nights when you just want to get home and put the world on pause. I had dinner with some friends, and after a few drinks, was ready to head back to my apartment. I ordered a ride, my usual route, nothing special. I was still buzzing from the night, scrolling through my phone and letting my mind drift as I waited. When the car pulled up, it seemed like any other, a mid-sized sedan with tinted windows. The driver gave me a friendly wave as I climbed in. It felt like an average Uber ride, the kind you barely notice, just a transition from one place to another. I even nodded at the driver as we started moving, but that's when things began to feel off. The driver, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, didn't say much at first. I thought he was just focused on the road, but then he asked in a calm, casual tone if I lived around here. I told him yes, and gave him the name of my neighborhood. He nodded, but then asked about my studies, if I was in college or working. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was just being polite, right? But then he asked if I always took this route home, even though it was only about a 10-minute drive. I answered quickly, trying not to sound weirded out, but his next question threw me off completely. What's it like at your apartment? Is it quiet? I bet you can hear the neighbors easily, huh? That was too specific, too much for a random question in a rideshare. I tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe he had just made a lucky guess. After all, people ask questions all the time. But as we drove, he kept diverting the conversation toward more personal things. Where I worked, how often I went out at night, who I lived with. I started getting uncomfortable, feeling like I was being interrogated. The worst part, he kept ignoring the GPS, taking turns that didn't make sense, making random right turns onto streets I didn't recognize. I looked at the app on my phone, and it seemed like we were heading in the opposite direction of where I needed to go. I tried to stay calm, but the unease was growing. He was either lost or intentionally taking me off track. Finally, I decided to speak up. "Hey, I think you missed the turn," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you follow the GPS, please?" He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his face still calm, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked at me. Then he gave a small, almost too polite smile and said, "Oh, the traffic is awful that way. We're just going to take a quick detour. Don't worry about it." But the detour was only leading us further away from familiar streets. My gut twisted, and I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. There was no longer any doubt in my mind. This was not just an ordinary ride. The panic started to rise in my chest, and I glanced at the locks on the door, instinctively trying to see if they were working. They were, but that didn't make me feel any safer. I thought about calling someone, sending a message, anything. But then I realized the driver had already locked all the windows. Panic bubbled up inside me as I stared at the locked door handle. My heart raced, and my mind raced even faster. What the hell was happening? Why was he taking me further away from where I needed to be? I knew I had to act fast. I could try to jump out of the car if I needed to, but that might just make things worse. I kept telling myself to stay calm, that maybe it was all just some weird coincidence, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I decided to try to stay composed, keeping the conversation light. "So, where are you taking me exactly?" I asked, my voice wavering slightly. The driver didn't respond immediately, but I could see his eyes flicker to the rearview mirror. He just kept driving, and then finally he answered. "There's a shortcut I know about," he said, his tone completely calm. But the look on his face? It wasn't calm. It was almost too calm, like he was enjoying this. My mind was racing and every instinct was screaming at me to get out of the car, but I had no idea where we were, and stopping in a strange place at night felt even worse. I kept telling myself to wait, to figure out a way out, but every second felt like it was drawing me further into whatever nightmare this was. The car slowed as we turned onto a dimly lit road, and my anxiety surged. We were now in a more isolated area, with no streetlights and houses that looked abandoned. I looked at my phone again, and the map was showing that we were far from my apartment, way farther than I'd ever imagined. I felt trapped. My mind raced for an escape plan, but I couldn't think clearly. I tried to subtly glance at my surroundings, hoping for something familiar, some landmark that could tell me where we were, but everything was foreign. I felt completely out of control. A sudden chill swept over me, and I wondered if I had made a huge mistake getting into this car. The driver's silence was suffocating, and I couldn't tell if he was aware of my growing panic or if he was enjoying it. As the car continued down the dark road, I felt my breath becoming shallow, each heartbeat louder than the last. Then, without warning, the driver turned off the engine. "We're here," he said, almost too cheerfully. I froze, my eyes scanning the area, trying to make sense of what was happening. We were in front of an empty lot, surrounded by tall, dark trees. I was no longer in control. No longer in a place where I could trust my surroundings. I knew deep down that this was the moment. If I didn't do something now, I might never get another chance. My heart was hammering in my chest, and the cold sweat on my skin was making my clothes stick to me. I had to make a decision, and fast. I reached for my phone with shaking hands, and just as I was about to text a friend, the driver turned to me with a cold smile. "Don't bother," he said quietly, almost like he had read my mind. My blood ran cold. He had already anticipated my move. I could feel the fear gripping me, but I forced myself to act. I kept my eyes on him, not making any sudden moves. Then, without warning, I opened the door and bolted out of the car, running as fast as I could. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely hear my feet hitting the pavement. The driver didn't follow, but I could feel his gaze on me from the car as I ran. I didn't dare look back, knowing that every second was precious. I wasn't sure how far I had run, but I kept going until I saw lights from a nearby street. Only then did I stop, gasping for breath, every muscle in my body trembling. I never saw that driver again, and I never spoke to anyone about it. I tried to forget it, to block out the fear that still occasionally creeps up on me when I get into a car. But every time I take an Uber now, my eyes instinctively glance at the rearview mirror, and my hands subconsciously check that the doors are unlocked. I've learned to trust my instincts, no matter how small the warning signs seem. Looking back, I can never be sure what the driver's true intentions were. Was it a coincidence? Or was I just one of many passengers he had carefully picked? All I know is that sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear his voice in my head, as if he's waiting for the next opportunity.